Thank you.
All right, so before anything, I feel it's good to start all services with just a quick moment of prayer. God, I want to thank you for giving me this chance to provide light to your words you've already given to us. God, I pray for Miss Annette's sister. She's going through a terrible, struggling time right now, but however, it's something that is planned for, something that you have realized was going to happen, and it will do something through that we will never understand. However, today, I pray that you keep me quiet, but allow you to be loud and clear through this sermon. Amen. All right, so I've already met some of you this morning. For those who haven't gotten a formal greeting, hi, I'm raised with Michael, Miss Cook. We've already spent, an hour or two together just getting to know each other. I think me and Miss Denise have maybe had about an hour to about a 30-minute interaction. I've seen you, Miss Vinny Lou, at work sometimes, so I've only gotten the chance to say hey maybe once or twice. But everyone else is relatively new face, except for my own father sitting here today. And a little bit of backstory on me, I guess. I'm currently studying Christian ministries at Brigham Parker along with business, and I've been working on electromech, trying to go around, fix scoreboards, usually working in sales. And I'm relatively new to all this. In fact, Ms. Cook can tell you that this is actually the first sermon I'm actually given. So because of that, I've also been recommended to say, if I get anything wrong, don't blame that on Brigham Parker. Blame that on the fact that I've only been there for about 2 years. And I don't mean wrong in the sense that I pronounce a word wrong, because there's going to be a Greek word for the sermon that I will pronounce wrong, I can guarantee it, but in the sense that if I accidentally mess up something theologically, that's not something on Brigham Parker, that's something on me. However, before I jump into God's word, I actually want to break some ice by pointing out some similarities between us. First of all, despite being 21, I have terrible knees. Who here has terrible knees? All right, we got one other person in the crowd. I think I was 18. I went to a state wrestling tournament, tore my ACL, and ended up having knee surgery. And I'm pretty sure a good portion of us in here have probably had some kind of surgery. They're terrible. They're awful. So every so once in a while, I might be stepping up here, and you might be like, he's walking funny. That's the reason. The other similarity I can probably put between some of us is that I have absolutely terrible eyesight. Who else has terrible eyesight? Just without glasses. Oh, yeah. I'm already getting some nods about that. I have contacts in right now, and without contacts, the world looks like the version of itself that a young child would draw, and then you put that drawing on the refrigerator. I'm pretty sure we've all had that kind of experience with other children and things like that. There's a similarity that I'm not sure that I share with everybody here, but I know that I do share with two of my grandmas, and it's the fact that I get nervous a lot. In fact, when I'm talking to relatively important people, this is true when I'm even talking to my Uncle Alan at work, who is the president of the company. When I go on a date with a pretty girl who I'm a little bit intimidated by, when I'm talking to the president of the college, an athletic director, or even when I'm working in sales on the phone, I'll get a little shake. I'll get a little shake and I'll get a little nervous, because I don't know where that conversation is actually going to go. It would get really bad. In high school, there was a point where I even had a panic attack while in football practice. It got so bad that I literally could not talk, and I ended up being taken to a doctor's office and was not able to speak for about 2 to 3 hours that day. However, fortunately, I have a mother who's able to see clues as when these kind of events are going to take place. Normally, she'll say, range you're at a 10, bring it down to a 4. I have close friends in college that do that also. I'm sure that you've had to say that to your kids at some point when they're acting up. When they're talking loud at a restaurant, you say, you're at a 10, bring it down to a 4. You're telling them to calm down. The source of this worry and anxiety seems to be, for me, at least, the approach of a dreadful consequence. I'm using consequence in like the very, very, very loose term. In a sense, more like a chemical reaction to a thing happening. The closest example I can think of this that I think is a little funny is that when I was a kid, I used to have this irrational fear of bees. Who's all been stung by a bee or a wasp? Yeah? All right. There we go. When I was watching too much TV when I was about 6 years old, my mom and dad saw this, and they had the bright idea to go send me outside. I needed this outside. I needed the sunshine because I wasn't getting enough of it. However, I remember hearing when I was 6 years old, just this little bee just go right past my ear. And because I was 6 and I was scared of bees, I just started crying. That fear of bees, of irrationality, stayed until I was about 14 years old. While playing hide-and-go-seek at youth one time, I thought it would be smart to hide in some bushes. Little did I know, the bushes were not the property of the church. Instead, they were the property of a colony of yellow jackets. One ER trip later, I am no longer afraid of bees. Not to say that that fear has been replaced by yellow jackets, but that's to say I understand what it's like to be stung now. I understand the reaction that my body has. I've been stung by a wasp before now, and I don't tend to get too bad of a reaction. The fear of the unknown is dead once you know what the unknown is. But that being said, the unknown usually stays that way. So the question is, how do we handle that fear? I want to turn to Matthew chapter 8, 23 through 27. I don't know how many of you guys are using your phones or prefer a more printed Bible. Out of this, I'm using the New King James Version. I normally like to read out of the New American Standard Bible. However, I've also heard that most of y'all use the normal King James Version, and I figured this would be a nice middle ground. Once again, in Matthew chapter 8, 23 through 27. Now when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea that the boat was covered with waves. But he was asleep. When the disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." But he said to them, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, "Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Before I actually get into the meat of this verse, I want to look at why Matthew is writing, get a little bit of this historical context. When Mark, Luke, and Matthew were writing the Synoptic Gospels, their goal was to record an accurate biography of Jesus. They didn't just take into account their own personal accord like how John did. They would go and find other witnesses and gather information. And they each wrote the Gospels, which are biographies of Jesus, with specific goals. Mark wanted to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. Luke wanted to show that the God of the Jews was offering salvation to the Gentiles. What Matthew wanted to do was prove to the Jewish community in Israel that Jesus Christ is the one Messiah that they have been waiting for. He is the one their prophecies have pointed towards. Matthew's kind of broken up into various patterns. You'll see two different types of sections in Matthew. There is narrative, such as the Sermon on the Mount and parables. There is discourse, like the Sermon on the Mount and parables, and there is narrative, like what we are about to cover here. Specifically, we're talking about his Galilean ministry. So let's break down this story. So, we start in trouble. Not only are the disciples on a boat, there's a storm brewing. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I don't even like it when it rains down I-16. In fact, I was driving back home from Atlanta just yesterday, and it just starts pouring rain, and I could barely see, and I hated it. And it was just a light drizzle. So I can't imagine how much the disciples must have hated this on the water. In fact, I'm pretty convinced that rain and storms only offer two good things in my life. One, in high school, I got to miss football practice. That barely happened even then. Second is that it lets me have an excuse to not go a place. In other words, this storm provides a willing obstacle for me that if I'm lazy enough, I can abuse. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. It's common knowledge that storms in the Bible generally lead to complete destruction. Jesus also understands the power of storms. In his Sermon on the Mount, if you want for a citing for this, specifically in Matthew, I won't cite the verse directly, but it is Matthew 5:24 through 27. While discussing the building of whether a house should be built on a solid rock or sand, not having solid ground is a perfect way for a storm to ruin your life. The disciples don't have solid ground, they're on a boat. Liquid amplifies the problem. The disciples respond in the most logical way possible, in my opinion, in verse 25. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him. Lord, save us, we are perishing. When I first read that in the New King James Version that I was reading, I thought it was too extreme. I mean, it's perishing. So that's when I went and I decided to check the Greek. I figured that in reality, what they would have said is, oh Lord, we're going to die. Oh Lord, some sort of extreme. I've said extreme things before. The word that they use is apulemi. That means destruction, to wipe away, to mar, to damage. But most of all, it means to lose. Not in the sense one would lose their car keys, not in the sense that one would lose a bobby pin, but in a sense to purposely break down to the point where it could never be found again. In that sense, the disciples were scared of perishing. I looked it back up in English. Perish means the complete ruin or destruction of something. This is what's called a direct translation. Lord, save us. We are perishing. However, what's interesting that happens next is that even though the disciples are going to Jesus because they are perishing, which would be, hey, that's a better reaction than I would first have, to be honest. I think often at times we don't see Jesus as our first answer. They do. Jesus responds to them by saying, why are you fearful, O you of little faith? That's not the most encouraging thing to hear. I think I've established pretty well the disciples' perspective on storms. They're not pleasant. So, most of us have heard this story before in Sunday school. And spoiler alert, they survived. So there's a little bit of dramatic irony since Matthew can't be dead and also be writing the most important biography in human history about the most important man of all time who was also God. So we know that they get out okay, but they didn't know they got out okay. Or did they? That's where the story gets more interesting. They already believe that Jesus is the Messiah. A Messiah at that has not yet completed his mission. So they wouldn't have gotten on the boat in the first place if they didn't already trust that he was the Messiah. So they got enough faith to get on the boat, but not enough faith to stay on it. Guys like Peter and Andrew were already called to no longer worry about the Sea of Galilee. In fact, they left it behind to follow Jesus. So they trust him with everything that is not their home turf. As we continue on in verse 26, then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. 27. So the men marveled and saying, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? These two verses show us a couple different things. Most obvious, Jesus controls the storm. He is God. That's clear. That's evident. But that last verse, the men marveled by saying, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? We find out in Luke chapter 5, before Jesus even called Peter and Andrew, James and John, he already controlled the seas and the winds in front of them. Starting off in Luke 5, verse 5, "But Simon answered and said to him, 'Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net.' And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners on the boat to come and help them. And they came and they filled both boats, so they began to sink." If you really want to push it also, Jesus' first public miracle was turning water into wine. If he's going to turn water in pots to wine, other than fish and salt, what's different from the water in the pots versus the water in the sea? Jesus' power is demonstrated time and time again. Yet when danger seems to be afoot, the disciples' default mode is to panic. But we're kind of asking some other questions here. All I'm stating is a disciple's reaction to a storm. In reality, we all have these natural reactions. So what does this actually have to do with calmness? We can gather the lesson that Jesus protects us, but it's only head knowledge at the moment. There's another story in Matthew 8 that I want to go over, and it's an important part due to how Matthew writes his biographies. When Matthew's doing this, biographies in ancient past did not tend to be in chronological order. They tend to be sectional in how things were important. That's why narratives have their own section and events have their own section. So Matthew, when writing chapter 8, pairs this in the same chapter as he does the calming of the storm. Matthew 8, 5 through 10. "Now Jesus had entered Capernaum. A centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, 'Lord, my servant is at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented.' And Jesus said to him, 'I will come and heal him.' The centurion answered and said, 'Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it.' So when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, 'Assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' And Jesus said to the centurion, 'Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you.' And the servant was healed that hour." Let's compare these stories. First of all, the stakes. I assumed at first while reading this, the servant must be have some kind of illness, right? Paralyzed, maybe he's sick in bed, don't necessarily know what happened. An illness compared to a storm, there is still a factor of unknown fear. A storm, you don't necessarily know if you're going to get thrown off the boat, eaten by sharks, or come back to shore with a broken rib cage. And with a sickness, you don't know how long it's going to be, especially back then when they did not have as great as physicians as we do now, but also because you don't know what the consequences of being that sick could be. The centurion describes the servant as laying at home paralyzed and dreadfully tormented. Much like a storm, the situation is dire. Like I've said, I've been using the word sickness, but in reality, if we go through back this verse, there was no disease described in those verses. The servant could be suffering from a physical injury. A physical injury could have been caused by a storm. Maybe not a literal storm like the disciples would be in later, but it's a physical injury nonetheless, arguably worse than death. So, let's point out the differences again between the disciples who were not harmed in the storm versus a currently suffering servant. Jesus responds, "I will come and heal him." Then we get something interesting here. That's when the centurion pops back up. He says, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. Pay attention to this first part in verse 9. For I am also a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. And another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. I don't want to focus on the unworthy part. I think without Christ, we are all unworthy, and we need his grace to become worthy. That's why he was sent to die on the cross. But in verse 9, the centurion makes a realization that the disciples couldn't in their whole time in being with Jesus. That first part again. For also I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. With this one sentence, the reaction is clear. If you are the authority of the cosmos, then all of the universe obeys you in your word. With a spoken word, God created the universe, and with a spoken word, he declared it is finished. Jesus responds, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. At which point he then goes on, and the servant was healed. Compare again to verse 26. But he said to them, why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. The Roman centurion, a member of the ruling government that would put Jesus on a cross, had more faith than the disciples who saw him already command the sea with his words before they even got on a boat. That's when this concept of calmness clicked for me. In order to face the danger of injury in the storm, faith in Christ needs to be this logical basis in all things. Of course, there's going to be storms. We won't deny that. We have suffered before in our lives. But once you realize that Christ's plan for you will prevail, who cares how bad the rain is going to be? There's something bigger than that. If I'm being honest, after reading the story, I think in a little bit of irony, I don't think Jesus was calming the storm. I think he was calming the disciples. So the men marveled, saying, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? A demonstration of power and strength to strengthen the disciples' faith. The disciples didn't trust that because they were with Jesus, who was sleeping, by the way. Jesus was sleeping. I don't think the storm would have killed them. They wouldn't have perished. They didn't trust that they would survive. But the soldier was already calm because he knew who was in charge. I want to close with a personal story. There's no need to come up and play the piano since we have some few people here. But it reminded me of this. Last Thursday, Friday, my father, my brother, and I, we went to go fix the scoreboard at Johnson County. We had to go up this ladder that I would say is about 14 feet tall. It was about 14 feet tall. And I remember our father having to place it kind of right to the side of the scoreboard. It was on really soft dirt. It was this really, really, really terrible situation, I thought at first. And it doesn't sound like a good combo. I don't know how many of you guys have actually gone up on ladders to fix roofs, or how many of you have actually had sons or husbands do that. But I imagine after looking at him go on that ladder, you see that and you go, don't want to do that? That looks dangerous. My brother and I didn't have the skills to do anything but to hold onto a ladder for about 5 seconds before wanting to go back down. And to be honest, I didn't even make it up the whole ladder until my brother was able to, and out of pure spite and brotherly love, I wanted to do it as well. But there our father was, who was able to stay up there the whole time while using both hands to repair this scoreboard. And after 10 seconds, my legs would shake. And I would lose faith in the ladder. After reading this verse, it's come to my attention that the ladder was the boat. It was this thing I happened to be on, but the boat wasn't supporting the disciples. In reality, I had someone who knew exactly where to place the ladder, who had complete control over it, and to steady the ladder if it were to wobble or fall. I was not calm on the ladder because I didn't realize the real person in control of it was my own dad. He had asked me to go with him. He knew precisely where to put the ladder and the tools needed for the scenario. Most of all, he understood the ladder in ways that I never could because he had gone through it so many times before. I was safe the entire time, and I didn't even know it. Calm is achieved once you realize the source and base of your safety has nothing to do with this world. You can be in the storm. You can have a loved one sick and suffering. Or you can be 20 foot up on a ladder. But in reality, there is a greater power in the current situation you are in. And that greater power has a plan for you. And that's where we'll end today. Before I pray us out, Miss Denise, if you could come up and begin leading us in a song. I'm normally not an altar call person, but I understand that, if need be, the situation may arise. So we'll allow for the singing to commence. And I'll stand up here if anyone needs any prayer.